The chapel was cloaked in shadows, the only light coming from tall candles flickering against the polished wood of the pews. The air was thick with the scent of lilies, heavy and mournful. Elizabeth Parker sat in the front row, her gloved hands clasped tightly together, her eyes fixed on the mahogany casket that held her husband of 40 years. William Parker had been many things to the world: a businessman, a benefactor, a man of charm and authority. But to Elizabeth, he had simply been her partner, her anchor. Now at 65, dressed in a black veil that softened the lines of grief on her elegant face, she felt as though half her life had been buried with him. Mourners whispered around her, their voices a low hum of condolences and speculation. Family friends recounted William's achievements in hushed tones, colleagues praised his brilliance, and neighbors shared quiet stories of his kindness. Elizabeth listened numb, each word a reminder of the man she had lost. She thought the day could hold no further shocks until the chapel doors opened. A young woman, striking and poised, stepped inside. Her heels clicked against the marble floor as she walked slowly down the aisle, her eyes not on the coffin, but on Elizabeth. The whispers grew louder. Who was she? Why was she here? The woman carried no grief in her expression, only purpose. When she reached the front, she turned to face the gathered mourners, her voice steady and sharp. "My name is Samantha Reed," she announced, "and I am William Parker's daughter." Gasps rippled through the room like a sudden storm. Elizabeth's grip tightened around her gloves, her heart hammering against her ribs. William's daughter. Impossible. Yet Samantha spoke with confidence, her gaze daring anyone to challenge her. She claimed her place, not among the mourners, but among the heirs. Elizabeth did not respond, not then. She kept her composure, her face calm, even as her world threatened to fracture anew. Inside, however, a cold fire began to burn. Was it betrayal from beyond the grave? Or something far more calculated? She thought a single lie could buy her a fortune. The narrator's voice lingered like an echo. But what she didn't know was that the truth of blood cannot be faked. The candles flickered as Elizabeth lowered her eyes silently, vowing that she would uncover the truth, no matter how dark it was. Follow for more chilling family revenge stories. Elizabeth Parker had lived a life built on steadiness, loyalty, and devotion. For 40 years, she had been the wife of William Parker, a man admired in business circles for his sharp mind and in social circles for his generosity. Together, they had built a fortune that reached nearly $30 million, a mixture of shrewd investments, real estate, in the quiet empire of a family-run company that bore the Parker name. Yet for Elizabeth, the true wealth was not measured in dollars. It was measured in the life they had shared, the home they built together, the dinners filled with laughter, the milestones of their only son, Michael. Michael Parker, at 38, had always been the pride of the family. Level-headed, hardworking, and fiercely protective of his parents, he had grown up under the example of William's discipline and Elizabeth's warmth. He was the natural heir to the Parker legacy, and William had often said so in public. "Michael will carry us forward," he would declare at family gatherings, raising his glass. "He is my greatest achievement." Those words had etched themselves into Elizabeth's heart. For all the wealth they had accumulated, nothing mattered more than family continuity. The funeral had been meant as closure, a final goodbye. But Samantha Reed's sudden intrusion shattered that fragile illusion. At 40 years old, she carried herself with the confidence of someone used to manipulating rooms. She was beautiful, in a sharp, polished way. Her dress tailored, her makeup precise, her chin lifted, just enough to exude entitlement. She looked too prepared, too rehearsed to be a grieving daughter, stumbling into the truth of her lineage. When she announced herself as William's child, the air in the chapel thickened with disbelief. Heads turned toward Elizabeth, searching her face for confirmation or denial. Michael's jaw tightened as he stepped closer to his mother, his protective instinct immediate. "This is nonsense," he whispered to her, though his voice carried a tremor of unease. But Samantha was undeterred. She produced photographs, old faded images of a younger William, standing beside a woman Elizabeth did not recognize. Letters yellowed at the edges, written in William's hand, though the words were vague enough to be read as friendship, or more. And finally, a birth certificate, bearing Samantha's name with the father's line left blank, but suggested in her every word. "I am his daughter," she repeated, her voice rising above the murmurs, "and I have a right to what is mine." The blow struck Elizabeth in two places at once, the heart and the memory. The heart, because to imagine William hiding such a secret for 20 years was to imagine her marriage built on a fracture. The memory, because she recalled moments when William had been distant business trips, extended without explanation, days when his eyes seemed lost in thought. She had brushed them aside, trusting him fully. But now those cracks threatened to widen into chasms. Michael reacted with anger, calling Samantha's claim opportunistic, an insult to their father's memory. The guests at the funeral exchanged uneasy glances. Some whispered their doubts. After all, wealthy men often carried secrets. Others defended Elizabeth, insisting William would never betray her so cruelly. Elizabeth herself remained silent, her composure, a mask hiding the storm inside. She did not cry out, did not rage. She listened, absorbing every word Samantha spoke, every glance of pity or suspicion cast in her direction. In that silence, a wound formed, not only the pain of possibly being deceived by her late husband, but also the humiliation of facing it in front of a crowd that once revered their family. That night alone, in the vast emptiness of her bedroom, Elizabeth stared at the portrait of William that hung above the mantel. His painted eyes seemed steady, faithful, the man she had loved and trusted. "Did you," she whispered to the silence, "did you betray me after all these years?" Her grief, already heavy now, carried the weight of betrayal. To mourn a husband was one thing. To mourn a husband who might have lived a double life was another. Yet beneath the sorrow, a cold determination began to stir. Whether Samantha spoke the truth or lies, Elizabeth needed to know. She needed to face not only the loss of her husband, but the ghost of his possible infidelity. Michael urged her to dismiss the claim, to treat Samantha as an opportunist, preying on the chaos of grief. But Elizabeth could not. She had spent her life believing in order, in honesty, in legacy. To leave the question unanswered would mean living in doubt, and doubt was a poison she refused to swallow. Thus the stage was set, a widow, standing between the memory of her husband and the bold claim of a stranger. The Parker family, once united in the glow of wealth and reputation, now faced whispers of scandal and shadows of deceit. Elizabeth knew the days ahead would be brutal. Samantha was not the kind to disappear quietly. The woman had come prepared, with documents, with poise, with the ruthless confidence of someone seeking fortune. But Elizabeth, though weary with grief, carried something stronger than Samantha's ambition. The calm patience of a woman who understood that truth, however deeply buried, always had a way of rising to the surface. And so, as the Parker estate mourned William's passing, another story began to unfold. One not of love and legacy, but of suspicion, betrayal, and the fight to protect the integrity of a family's name. The days following the funeral were a blur of condolences, paperwork, and endless whispers. Yet woven through the grief was the sharp edge of Samantha Reed's intrusion. She had not come only to pay respects, she had come armed. At the first formal family meeting with the estate lawyer, Samantha laid her arsenal on the polished oak table, photographs of a younger William, with an unfamiliar woman letters, folded carefully into envelopes that carried William's unmistakable handwriting, and a timeline that suggested she had been hidden away for decades. The letters were the cruelest blow. They were filled with words that could be read as love. "I will always look out for you. You are a part of me, no matter the distance." Vague enough to resist proof, yet sharp enough to pierce Elizabeth's heart. She knew William's handwriting too well to dismiss them as forgeries. Still, there was no mention of Samantha by name, no explicit declaration of paternity. It was smoke, but not yet fire. The family lawyer, a gray-haired man named Arthur Benson, who had been with the Parkers for years, adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. Mrs. Parker, Mr. Parker's will is clear in its intentions. His estate passes to you and your son Michael. However, he hesitated, glancing at Samantha, who sat across the table with practiced composure. If Miss Reed can prove she is Mr. Parker's biological daughter, then under state law she may have a claim to a portion of the estate. The court would take DNA evidence seriously. Michael slammed his hand on the table. This is outrageous. My father never mentioned her. Not once. How dare she? Elizabeth placed a hand on her son's arm, her voice calm. Michael, anger won't serve us. We will meet this with reason. But inside her composure was crumbling. Was this truly possible? Had William betrayed her so deeply? For 40 years, she had believed in the man she married, and now, she was asked to consider that his legacy was divided, that his love had been fractured by secrets. At night, she lay awake, staring at the empty space beside her, hearing echoes of conversations they'd shared, searching for signs she had missed. Yet alongside the pain grew a sharper instinct, the need to know. Doubt was unbearable, but truth, no matter how brutal, was something she could face. Quietly, without fanfare, Elizabeth began her preparations. She did not announce her plans to Michael, nor to Arthur Benson. She knew Samantha would expect resistance, perhaps even a legal battle. What she would not expect was patience and precision. The first step was opportunity. At a brunch meeting arranged to discuss matters civilly, Elizabeth invited Samantha to her home. Samantha arrived in a fitted suit. Her smile polished her tone sweet with condescension. I don't want to make this harder than it has to be, Mrs. Parker, she said over tea. But the truth is the truth. I deserve to be acknowledged. My father would have wanted it. Elizabeth nodded, feigning weakness, letting her hands tremble slightly as she poured the tea. Perhaps you are right, my dear. William was a complicated man. If he did have another child, I only want to understand. Samantha's expression softened into triumph. She thought she had won. When Samantha excused herself to the restroom, Elizabeth seized her moment. On the vanity counter, Samantha had left a small travel brush, strands of blonde hair caught in its bristles. Elizabeth slipped it into a tissue, folded it neatly, and slid it into her handbag before Samantha returned. She smiled politely, as though nothing had happened, though her heart pounded like a drum. Over the next days, Elizabeth repeated her careful game. A coffee cup left behind after a meeting. A napkin Samantha dabbed her lipstick with. Each item collected discreetly, each one placed into a sealed envelope. Evidence. Elizabeth contacted a private genetics laboratory, recommended quietly by a trusted physician, a place known not for publicity, but for confidentiality. She met with the director, a kind-eyed woman who assured her that results would be handled with the utmost discretion. We only need a confirmed DNA sample of Mr. Parker's for comparison, the director explained. Elizabeth had already prepared. She provided William's old hairbrush, which still held strands of his silver hair preserved carefully in a drawer. She also brought a razor from his travel kit, blades dotted faintly with traces of blood from years past. The lab accepted them with professional care. Then came the waiting. Days stretched into weeks, each one weighted with tension. Samantha continued to press her claim publicly, appearing at social events and introducing herself boldly as William Parker's daughter. She charmed some irritated others, but always commanded attention. The press sniffed at the story, eager for scandal. Hidden heir to $30 million fortune, read one headline. Elizabeth said nothing. Michael grew restless. Mother, we can't just let her smear Dad's name like this. We should go public, deny everything. Elizabeth shook her head, her voice quiet but firm. No, Michael. Let her talk. Let her shout. Lies exhaust themselves. Truth endures. One evening, as she sat alone in William's study, the weight of it all pressed upon her. She ran her fingers over the spines of his books, the framed photographs of their life together. How strange it was. She thought that she now sought science to tell her what her heart longed to deny. In that moment, she whispered into the silence, "If you betrayed me, William, I will face it. If you did not then, I will defend your honor with everything I have." A week later, the results arrived. Elizabeth opened the envelope with hands steady as stone. Her eyes scanned the conclusion: no biological relationship between William Parker and Samantha Reed. The relief was sharp, almost painful in its intensity. Betrayal had not come from her husband's grave. It had come from Samantha's lies. Elizabeth exhaled slowly, her composure unbroken. She closed the envelope, placed it into a leather folder, and whispered words that would become her guiding principle. Revenge is not anger, it's accuracy. She was ready. The Parker estate lawyer's office was a monument to order and tradition. Heavy curtains muted the sunlight. The shelves were lined with leather-bound volumes, and the scent of polished wood lingered in the air. A mahogany conference table stretched across the room, and around it sat the heirs of William Parker, gathered to hear the reading of his will. Elizabeth Parker, dressed in a simple black dress and a string of pearls, looked every bit the grieving widow. Her hands folded neatly in her lap, her face composed but pale. To the casual observer, she seemed fragile, weighed down by sorrow, and the complexities of a life abruptly shifted by loss. Across from her sat Samantha Reed, radiant and brimming with confidence. She wore a fitted navy suit, her hair styled into glossy waves, her lips painted the deep red of victory. She greeted the lawyer with a smile that hovered on arrogance. To her, this was not a solemn occasion. It was the day she claimed her prize. Michael Parker sat at his mother's side, his jaw set, his glare fixed on Samantha. Every instinct in him wanted to challenge her presence outright, to throw her from the room, but Elizabeth had urged him to stay calm. "Patience, Michael," she had whispered earlier. "Truth speaks loudest when delivered in silence." Arthur Benson, the family lawyer, adjusted his glasses and began. His voice was steady, deliberate, carrying the authority of decades in his profession. "We are gathered today to execute the last will and testament of William James Parker. Mr. Parker's instructions are clear, and I am bound to honor them fully." Samantha leaned forward, her smile widening. She folded her manicured hands over a designer clutch, already rehearsing the gracious acceptance speech she would deliver once her inheritance was secured. Benson continued reading clauses about minor bequests, donations to charities William had supported, and the formal distribution of assets. Elizabeth listened quietly. Her eyes lowered, her breath even. Samantha's eyes glittered with impatience, waiting for the moment her name would be spoken. Finally, Benson reached the central section. The bulk of Mr. Parker's estate, valued at approximately $30 million, is to be passed to his wife, Elizabeth Parker, and his son, Michael Parker, to be divided in accordance with the stipulations of the trust. A murmur went through the room. Samantha's smile faltered just slightly, but she recovered. "Excuse me," she said, smoothly interrupting. "And what of me? As Mr. Parker's daughter, I am entitled to recognition, if not a portion of the estate." Benson paused, his expression carefully neutral. "Miss Reed, your claim has been noted. However, the will makes no mention of you. Should you provide legal proof of paternity, the court would have the power to intervene. For now, I must proceed according to the document before me." Samantha laughed lightly, a sound meant to exude control. "Legal proof. I have photographs, letters, evidence of his relationship with my mother. Everyone in this room knows William Parker was my father." She glanced toward Elizabeth with a smirk, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "It must be painful for you, Mrs. Parker, to learn that your husband's legacy belongs to more than just you and your son. But truth is truth." Michael shifted, his face burning with fury, but Elizabeth placed a gentle hand on his arm. She lifted her gaze slowly, her expression calm, her voice soft but clear. "Truth is indeed truth, Miss Reed, which is why it must be proven beyond doubt." Samantha waved a dismissive hand. "My father's blood runs in my veins. That is all the proof I need." Elizabeth straightened, her posture regal, despite the weight of her mourning. She reached into her handbag and drew out a leather folder, placing it gently on the table. "You speak of blood," she said quietly. "Then let blood speak." The room stilled. Samantha's smile wavered. Elizabeth slid the folder toward Benson. "This is the result of a DNA analysis conducted by an independent accredited laboratory. It compares William Parker's DNA, taken from preserved personal items, with samples from Miss Reed. She folded her hands, again, her eyes never leaving Samantha's face. The conclusion is clear. Benson opened the folder, scanned the documents, and adjusted his glasses again. His voice when he spoke was deliberate. The results show conclusively that there is no biological relationship between William Parker and Samantha Reed. The words fell like a hammer. Gasps erupted from the assembled relatives and colleagues. Michael exhaled sharply, a smile breaking through his anger. Samantha's face shifted in a kaleidoscope of emotions, triumph collapsing into disbelief, disbelief twisting into panic, panic curdling into rage. "That's impossible!" she shouted, her composure shattering. "Those results are fake, manipulated. She must have tampered with them." Elizabeth did not raise her voice. She sat with the serenity of someone who had expected this moment, her gaze steady, her tone firm but gentle. "Blood does not lie, Samantha." "But you did." Samantha slammed a hand on the table, her voice shrill. "You're trying to erase me, to cut me out of what is rightfully mine?" "No," Elizabeth said softly, her words cutting sharper than anger ever could. "You tried to write yourself into a story that was never yours. My husband was many things, but he was not your father. And this," she gestured to the folder, to the undeniable science within, "this is the truth you cannot rewrite." The lawyer cleared his throat, attempting to restore order. "Given this evidence, Miss Reed, you have no claim to the Parker estate. Any attempt to pursue this matter further would be considered fraud." The room buzzed with whispers, some shocked, others vindicated. Samantha rose from her chair, her face pale, but her eyes blazing. "This isn't over," she spat before storming from the room, her heels striking the floor like gunshots. Elizabeth sat still, her breathing, even her hands folded once more in her lap. Around her, the murmurs grew: admiration, sympathy, relief. But she heard none of it. She heard only the quiet echo of her own words. Blood does not lie. And for the first time since William's death, she felt not only grief, but vindication. The shadow of betrayal had been lifted. The truth was hers, unshakable. The story broke like wildfire, faster than Samantha could contain it. Within 24 hours of the will-reading headlines splashed across newspapers and online feeds, fake heir caught in $30 million scam. DNA test exposes woman claiming to be William Parker's daughter. From confidence to collapse, Samantha Reed's bold lie unmasked. The glossy photographs of Samantha striding into the lawyer's office in her tailored navy suit, smiling as though she had already won, were now cruelly paired with screenshots of the DNA results in Elizabeth's calm, cutting words. "Blood does not lie, Samantha." "But you did." At first, Samantha tried to control the damage. She called a press conference, insisting the test results had been tampered with, accusing Elizabeth of bribery and manipulation. But the more she spoke, the more she sounded desperate. Reporters, once eager to cover her as a glamorous hidden heiress, now pressed her with sharper questions. "Do you have any verifiable proof? Why did William never acknowledge you publicly, if you're telling the truth? Why has every independent lab confirmed you're not related?" Her answers faltered her charm, fraying at the edges. The humiliation came in small doses at first, then in waves that drowned her. At her favorite upscale restaurant, she walked in expecting her usual table. The maitre d', who had once greeted her with warm deference, stiffened. "I'm sorry, Miss Reed. We don't have a reservation for you tonight." Samantha hissed that she was a regular, a loyal client. The man's smile was polite, but his eyes betrayed disdain. "We're fully booked. Perhaps another time." Behind her, patrons whispered, "That's her, the fake heiress." She stormed out, cheeks burning, her appetite lost. At the bank, she attempted to withdraw funds only to have her card declined. The teller, a young man with too much eagerness in his eyes, tried to mask his smirk. "I'm sorry, Miss Reed, there seems to be an issue with your account. Perhaps you should contact your attorney." She left the building with a pit in her stomach, knowing full well that no attorney wanted to represent her now. Indeed, her legal counsel had already cut ties. Her first lawyer, The one who had encouraged her to press forward with her claim sent a terse email. Given recent developments, our firm can no longer represent you. Please consider seeking alternative counsel. But there were no alternatives. Every reputable attorney had read the DNA results. None wanted their name attached to what had become a national embarrassment. The final blow came when her so-called friends began to vanish. Invitations to parties stopped arriving. Messages went unanswered. The socialites who had once welcomed her into their circles now treated her like a contagion. At one cocktail event, she dared to attend uninvited conversations, hushed as she approached. She overheard a woman whisper sharply into her companion's ear, "That's the fraud, the one who tried to steal from the Parkers." Faces turned away. Samantha stood for a moment frozen, then fled into the night, her heels echoing on the pavement like the drumbeat of exile. Humiliation piled on humiliation. Paparazzi caught her in moments of weakness, leaving a grocery store with a cheap bag of food, her hair unkempt, her expression hollow. The photos spread online, captioned with cruel sarcasm, "Heiress on a budget." Memes mocked her fall from grace. And yet the Parker family, once suspected of harboring secrets, emerged with sympathy. Elizabeth, with her quiet dignity, was praised in magazines, the widow who defended the truth. Michael was applauded for standing by his mother with strength and loyalty. Even William's legacy, threatened for a moment, was restored in the public's eyes, his name cleared of scandal by the undeniable science of DNA. For Samantha, the unraveling was more than public. It was personal. She found herself scrutinized in every interaction. At the pharmacy, the cashier's eyes lingered on her too long, as if she were a thief. At the gym, conversation stopped when she walked in. An old neighbor crossed the street to avoid her. Children whispered cruel nicknames as she passed the fake daughter. The world she had built, a fragile construct of ambition and deceit, collapsed brick by brick. No lawsuit could save her. No excuse could restore her. She had tried to write herself into the Parker story, but instead, she had become a footnote in theirs, a warning, not a legacy. One night, she sat alone in her apartment, scrolling through endless feeds. Article after article dissected her downfall. Every photo of her, once symbols of confidence, now felt like evidence of arrogance. She closed her laptop, staring at the silence around her. She had wanted millions. Instead, she had inherited emptiness. Meanwhile, Elizabeth Parker walked her garden in the soft glow of twilight. Neighbors who once whispered suspicion now greeted her with warmth. Strangers sent her letters of support, praising her patience and strength. She did not revel in Samantha's humiliation. Revenge was never about spectacle. It was about truth, about defending her husband's memory and her family's legacy. And truth had prevailed. But Samantha, left in the ruins of her own lies, learned the hardest lesson of all, that greed may build a stage, but truth always writes the final act. The weeks after her public humiliation should have silenced Samantha Reed, but instead, they fueled her desperation. She could not accept the collapse of her carefully constructed narrative. In her mind, losing the Parker fortune wasn't failure, it was theft. And so she gathered what little strength she had left and plotted her counterattack. She found a lawyer willing to take her case, not out of conviction, but out of greed for publicity. His name was Victor Harlan, a sharp-tongued litigator with a reputation for taking on hopeless causes if they guaranteed a spotlight. Samantha promised him headlines, and he promised her a chance to claw back control. Together, they filed a lawsuit accusing Elizabeth Parker of fraud, claiming that the DNA test results had been falsified, the samples tampered with, the entire process manipulated. The tabloids seized on the new angle. Was the widow too clever, fake heir, or real cover-up? The uncertainty, however manufactured, was enough to reignite whispers. Samantha gave interviews where she spoke of conspiracies, her voice trembling with feigned outrage. "All I want," she told one reporter, "is to be acknowledged. Elizabeth Parker is rewriting history to erase me." She went further. Digging into old boxes, she produced a grainy home video from 2 decades ago. In it, William Parker appeared at a charity event, shaking hands with a line of people. For a few seconds, the camera caught him speaking with a young woman, Samantha's mother. Samantha froze. The frame replayed it in slow motion and declared it proof of her connection. There, she insisted during a television interview. "You can see him with my mother. You can see the familiarity in his smile. He knew her. He knew me." The video spread quickly online, dissected by armchair detectives and gossip forums. Some viewers nodded in agreement, claiming the body language suggested intimacy. Others dismissed it as coincidence, nothing more than a polite exchange in a public setting. Still, the seeds of doubt were planted. Elizabeth watched these developments with a quiet ache in her chest. She did not fear losing the estate. The DNA evidence was airtight, verified by 2 independent labs. What grieved her was seeing William's name dragged through the mud, his reputation twisted by Samantha's narrative. He could no longer defend himself, and so she bore the burden of defending him. Every time Samantha's voice trembled on television, Elizabeth heard the subtle suggestion: William was unfaithful. William lied. At night, she sat alone in William's study, the smell of old leather and tobacco still lingering. She traced her fingers across the spines of his books, across the framed photographs of their life together. She whispered to the silence, "They're trying to destroy you. But I won't let them." The case made its way to court. The room was crowded with reporters, their pens ready to capture every word, every expression. Samantha entered with Victor Harlan at her side, her posture rigid, her eyes alight with defiance. Elizabeth entered quietly, Michael supporting her arm, her composure calm but resolute. The trial was brutal. Samantha's lawyer thundered accusations, painting Elizabeth as a manipulator, a cunning widow who had erased an inconvenient truth to protect her fortune. He waved the old video like a banner, insisting it was proof of a hidden affair. He called Samantha to the stand, where she wept theatrically, describing a childhood of secrecy, a mother's whispered promises that your father is William Parker. Elizabeth listened, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She did not flinch when the lawyer pointed at her and accused her of cruelty. She did not rise when Samantha screamed across the courtroom, "You stole everything from me. You made me nothing." Instead, she breathed deeply, remembering William's voice in her memory. The truth needs no defense. It only needs patience. Her lawyer, Arthur Benson, spoke plainly without theatrics. He presented the DNA results once more, this time, from 3 independent laboratories. He explained the chain of custody for the samples, the strict procedures, followed the impossibility of tampering. He cross-examined Samantha gently but firmly, asking her for any concrete proof beyond photographs, letters, or videos taken in public spaces. She faltered under the weight of facts, her anger rising as her evidence crumbled. The lowest point came in a heated session when Samantha, cornered by inconsistencies, erupted. She stood in the witness box, her face flushed with rage, and pointed a trembling finger at Elizabeth. "You!" she screamed. "You're my enemy! You've hated me since the moment I walked into that chapel. You're the reason I have nothing. You're the reason the world despises me. You've poisoned everyone against me." Her voice broke into a sobbing shriek. "You should have been the one in that coffin, not him." Gasps filled the courtroom. Even Victor Harlan looked stunned. The judge struck the gavel sharply, demanding order. Elizabeth did not move. Her face was pale, her eyes wet, but her voice, when she finally spoke, was calm. "I do not hate you, Samantha. I pity you. You have built your life on lies, and when they collapse, you blame anyone who dares to stand on truth. But know this, I will not let you drag William's name into the dirt. He was not perfect, but he was not yours. And that is the truth." The room fell silent. Samantha sank back into her seat. Her rage exhausted her accusations, ringing hollow. That night, Elizabeth returned home, weary but steady. She sat once more in William's study, the words of the day still echoing in her mind. She thought of his advice given long ago, when they had weathered a smaller storm. The truth needs no defense. It only needs patience. And she realized that was all she had to offer. Not arguments, not anger, just patience. Truth like stone endured. Lies like dust would scatter in time. Samantha had tried to wage war, but Elizabeth would not fight on those terms. She would wait, and in waiting, she would win. The courtroom was tense, filled with the low murmur of spectators and the scratch of journalists' pens. Everyone knew the verdict was near. The Parker case had become more than a legal battle. It was a spectacle, a morality tale broadcast across headlines. Was Samantha Reed truly the secret heir to a $30 million fortune? Or just a fraud who dared to exploit grief? Elizabeth Parker sat quietly at the front, her posture graceful, her black dress simple, her pearl earrings catching the faint light. Beside her, Michael sat with clenched fists, his eyes fixed on the judge's bench. Across the aisle, Samantha fidgeted in her chair, her once polished exterior unraveling. Weeks of public scorn had dimmed her confidence. Her suit was ill-fitting, her makeup heavy, as though painted on to hide the cracks. She tried to keep her chin high, but her eyes darted nervously toward the jury. The judge entered the gavel, striking once, and the room fell silent. Papers rustled, then stilled. All eyes turned forward. After reviewing the evidence presented, the judge began voice firm. This court finds the claims brought forth by Miss Samantha Reed to be without merit. The words carried the weight of a hammer. Samantha stiffened, her lips parting, as though she could argue with destiny. The judge continued. The DNA results, submitted independently by 2 accredited laboratories, establish conclusively that Miss Reed has no biological relationship to the late William Parker. The letters and photographs presented are insufficient to establish paternity, and the video evidence is circumstantial at best. Furthermore, given the pattern of deception uncovered during this trial, the court finds grounds for further investigation into possible fraud and attempted misrepresentation of inheritance. The gavel struck again. The claim is dismissed. A murmur of relief spread through the courtroom. Michael closed his eyes, exhaling sharply, his hand gripping his mother's. Elizabeth bowed her head, whispering a silent prayer of thanks. She had not sought revenge, only truth. Now truth had spoken with the authority of law. Samantha, pale and shaking, leapt to her feet. "This isn't fair! She rigged everything!" she shouted, pointing a trembling finger at Elizabeth. "She's lying! They're all lying!" But her words rang hollow. The bailiffs moved toward her as the judge struck the gavel again, demanding order. Samantha's cries echoed through the chamber, shrill and desperate before she was escorted out, her voice fading into silence. Outside the courthouse, the press swarmed Elizabeth. Flashbulbs lit her path as microphones stretched toward her voices, clamoring for a statement. "Mrs. Parker, how do you feel about the verdict? Do you have anything to say to Samantha Reed? What will you do now that your family's estate is safe?" Elizabeth paused on the courthouse steps, the weight of the world pressing on her. She looked into the cameras, her voice calm and steady. "This was never about money," she said. "It was about truth. My husband's legacy deserved honesty. Lies cannot rewrite blood, and greed cannot erase family. I am grateful to the court for restoring what was always ours. As for Miss Reed, I wish her healing. May she learn that deception only destroys." Her words were replayed on every news station that evening, framed not as a widow's vengeance, but as a widow's grace. Commentators praised her composure, her refusal to gloat. Public sympathy shifted fully to the Parker family. William's name was cleared. Michael was admired for standing by his mother, and Elizabeth became a symbol of resilience. Yet Elizabeth's mind did not linger on victory. She thought of the emptiness that had filled her nights since William's death, the gnawing pain of betrayal that Samantha had awakened. Winning the case did not erase that pain, but it gave her something she had not expected: clarity. She could not undo the past, but she could shape the future. And so a month after the trial ended, Elizabeth called a press conference, not in a courthouse, but in a modest community center. Reporters filled the room, expecting her to speak of victory, of inheritance, of the estate's next chapter. Instead, she announced something entirely different. With the estate secure, I have asked my son Michael to join me in creating a legacy worthy of William's name, she said. Today, we launched the Parker Foundation, dedicated to supporting orphans and students from disadvantaged families who wish to pursue medicine and healthcare. My husband believed deeply in opportunity and education. It is only right that his wealth should build futures, not battles. Gasps of surprise filled the room, followed by thunderous applause. Elizabeth stood tall, her hands resting on the podium, her heart steady. She was not simply preserving a fortune. She was transforming grief into hope. The foundation took root quickly. Scholarships were established for students who dreamed of becoming doctors, nurses, researchers. Funding went to orphanages and shelters, places where children without family could find care. Elizabeth visited these institutions personally, shaking hands, offering words of encouragement. She saw in those young faces the promise of renewal, the chance to break cycles of poverty and despair. Michael, standing proudly beside her, often said, "Mother, this is what Father would have wanted." And Elizabeth believed it was true. The legacy of William Parker was not the millions in his accounts, but the lives those millions would now change. Meanwhile, Samantha faded into obscurity. Investigations into her attempt at fraud revealed a long history of debts, failed schemes, and half-truths. Once a woman who sought fame, she now found her name spoken only as a warning. She had tried to seize a fortune through lies, but in the end, she was left with nothing but whispers and shame. Elizabeth, however, found peace. Each time she awarded a scholarship, each time she visited a child who had been given a new chance, she felt William's presence beside her. She had defended his name not with anger, but with patience. And now she was honoring it with purpose. The law had delivered justice, but Elizabeth's heart had chosen something greater: legacy. And in that choice, she discovered that the truest revenge was not Samantha's downfall, but the rising of something far more enduring: truth transformed into hope. The house was quiet in the late evening, the only sound the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Elizabeth Parker sat in her study, a cup of tea cooling beside her, the soft lamplight glowing against the wood-paneled walls. In the weeks since the trial had ended, she had been visited by reporters, neighbors, and acquaintances, all eager to congratulate her, to call her strong, to celebrate her victory. Yet here in the solitude of her home, Elizabeth did not feel victorious. She felt contemplative, as though standing at the end of a long road and looking back at the path that had carried her here. She reached for her journal, a leather-bound book that had held her private thoughts since William's passing. Opening to a blank page, she pressed the pen gently against the paper. Her handwriting was neat, but deliberate, each word carrying the weight of lived experience. "I did not fight because I hated her," she wrote, her pen steady. "I fought because lies cannot erase truth, and betrayal cannot destroy legacy." The words hung in the air, even after she set down her pen. She whispered them aloud, feeling their truth resonate in her bones. Hate had never been her motivation. Even in the darkest moments when Samantha pointed at her in the courtroom, her voice shrill with rage, Elizabeth had not felt hatred. What she had felt was sorrow. The ache of watching her husband's memory dragged through the mire, the sharp sting of seeing greed attempt to masquerade as blood. Her mind turned to William. She could still see him as a young man, tall and determined, building a business from nothing. She could still hear his laugh, warm and reassuring, and remember the countless nights they had sat together, planning not just for wealth, but for the kind of life they wanted to leave behind. Had he made mistakes? Likely. All men did. But betrayal of this magnitude, no. She knew now that Samantha's claim had been built on smoke, not substance. And she had defended him not out of bitterness, but out of love. Elizabeth leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes, allowing her thoughts to drift into the realm of philosophy. She thought of the lessons this ordeal had carved into her. Fame fades. She had seen it happen with Samantha, who strutted into their lives under the glare of attention, only to crumble once the truth emerged. Fame was fickle, fleeting, a firework that burned brightly for a moment before vanishing into smoke. Greed consumes. That too was evident. Samantha's hunger for wealth had devoured her dignity, her reputation, even her sense of self. She had wanted fortune so badly that she lied about blood itself, the most sacred truth of family. Greed was a flame that promised warmth, but ended in ash. But truth and patience endure. Elizabeth smiled faintly, hearing William's voice in her memory. The truth needs no defense. It only needs patience. How right he had been. She had not screamed, had not fought Samantha with venom. She had waited quietly, gathering evidence, trusting that patience would outlast deceit. And it had. Truth had stood like stone immovable, while Samantha's lies crumbled like sand. She rose and walked slowly to the window, gazing out at the garden William had planted years ago. The roses were blooming again, their fragrance drifting on the cool night air. Life went on. Seasons turned. The world healed itself in cycles. And perhaps people could too. Justice, she murmured, is not always about punishment. Sometimes it is simply about letting truth breathe. She thought of Samantha, her face twisted with rage in the courtroom, her voice breaking as she accused Elizabeth of theft. A younger Elizabeth might have delighted in Samantha's downfall, might have found satisfaction in her public disgrace. But now, with years of wisdom and loss carved into her, Elizabeth felt only pity. Samantha had tried to steal a legacy, but in the end, she had stolen only from herself. Returning to her desk, Elizabeth picked up her pen again. She wrote slowly, deliberately, as though addressing not just her journal, but anyone who might one day need her words. If you are ever betrayed, remember this. Betrayal does not define you. It defines the betrayer. Your task is not to destroy them, but to protect the truth. Anger will pass. Hatred will poison you. But patience will carry you through. The clock chimed softly in the distance. Elizabeth closed the journal, her hand resting on its cover. She felt lighter than she had in months, as though she had finally released the weight of vengeance and replaced it with wisdom. She whispered into the quiet room as though speaking to William himself. Fame fades, greed consumes, but truth and patience endure. The words became her mantra, a philosophy carved from pain, but tempered by love. She knew the world would forget the headlines soon enough, but this lesson, this truth, would outlast even her. And perhaps, just perhaps, it would guide those who came after her, ensuring that the Parker legacy was not one of scandal, but of strength, resilience, and honesty. Elizabeth extinguished the lamp, leaving the room in gentle darkness. The night outside was calm, and so at last was she. The morning light spilled softly across the Parker estate, gilding the old oak trees, and falling gently through the lace curtains of Elizabeth's bedroom. She was seated at her writing desk, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her pen poised above a fresh sheet of parchment. In her lap rested a small velvet box, worn smooth by time. Inside it lay her wedding ring, the gold band William had slipped onto her finger more than 4 decades earlier. She opened the box and touched the ring with tender fingers. Once, during the early years of their marriage, she had thought of selling it when money was tight. But something had stopped her. She had kept it not for its value in gold, but for the weight of love it represented. It had endured through every trial of their life together. And now she knew it would endure beyond her. She dipped her pen in ink and began to write a letter, her handwriting slow but steady. My dearest Anna, she began addressing her granddaughter, Michael's little girl, who was only 12 but already curious and thoughtful beyond her years. By the time you read this, I may no longer be here to guide you, but I want you to carry my words as though they were my voice. She paused, looking out the window at the garden where William had once planted roses for her. Then she continued, never let greed disguise itself as family. People will come into your life wearing masks, some pretending love, some pretending loyalty, but driven by hunger for what you have. Do not harden your heart, but do not blind it either. Trust, but verify. Believe in goodness, but never surrender truth to comfort. Comfort fades. Truth endures. Elizabeth set down her pen for a moment and opened the velvet box again. She lifted the ring, the cool metal, warming quickly in her palm. It glinted in the morning light, simple yet eternal. She smiled faintly as memory washed over her. The sound of William's voice on their wedding day, the way his hand had trembled slightly as he placed it on her finger. This ring, she wrote, was once almost sold in desperation. But I held on to it, not because of its worth, but because of what it stood for. Real love. Anna cannot be bought or faked. It is proven through sacrifice, patience, and truth. This ring will be yours one day. Not as a jewel, but as a reminder. Let it tell you every time you look at it that love which is real never has to pretend. Her hand trembled slightly as she signed her name, "With all my love, grandmother." Later that week, she called Anna into her study. The young girl entered shyly, her dark hair braided neatly, her eyes wide with curiosity. Elizabeth motioned for her to sit beside her. "Anna," she said softly, taking the child's hand, "there are things you must learn sooner than I had hoped. Our family has been tested, and one day you too may face trials. I want you to carry something for me." She placed the velvet box in Anna's hands. The girl opened it carefully, her breath catching when she saw the ring. "It's beautiful," Anna whispered. Elizabeth smiled gently. "Yes, but more than beautiful, it is true. This ring is not about gold or value. It is about promises kept. It is about patience, even when tested. It is about love that cannot be forged or faked. Do you understand?" Anna nodded, her eyes shining. "I think so, Grandma." Elizabeth stroked her granddaughter's hair. "Keep it safe, and when you are grown, let it remind you of this greed will always come dressed as something else. Family, friendship, even love. But true love never demands lies, and truth never asks you to betray yourself. If you remember that you will never lose your way." Anna threw her arms around her grandmother, hugging her tightly. Elizabeth held her close, breathing in the innocence of youth, praying silently that her words would take root and bloom in the girl's heart. When Anna left the room, Elizabeth returned to her desk, watching the sunlight move slowly across the floor. She felt the quiet certainty of a torch, passed not in fire, but in wisdom. The Parker name would endure, not through wealth alone, but through the lessons carved by truth. And as the day faded into evening, Elizabeth whispered to the memory of William, "The legacy is safe. She will carry it forward." The study was bathed in amber light, the kind of golden glow that arrives only at the end of a quiet day. Elizabeth sat at her desk, her journal open before her, its pages filled with the story of lost betrayal and hard-earned truth. She had written it all down, not for herself, for she already carried every moment in her heart, but for those who would come after her. Her pen rested now, the ink still fresh on the final page. She closed the journal gently, her hands lingering on the leather cover. The afternoon sun streamed through the window, warming her fingers, easing the ache in her bones. In that stillness, she allowed herself to breathe deeply, not as a woman in battle, but as one who had finally laid down her burdens. She thought of William, of Michael, of little Anna, holding the wedding ring with wide-eyed reverence. She thought of the trials that had nearly broken her, of Samantha's fury, and the courtroom storms of nights spent wondering whether truth would ever triumph over lies. And she thought of what had been won, not just an inheritance, not just a name cleared, but something greater, a legacy protected, a lesson preserved. Her voice, soft and steady, seemed to float into the still air. "If it were you, would you let a lie steal your family's legacy? Or would you fight for the truth?" The question lingered, a gentle challenge, not just to her own children and grandchildren, but to anyone who might one day face deception, cloaked as love greed, dressed as family. Elizabeth rose, placing the journal carefully beside the velvet box that held her wedding ring. She looked once more out at the garden, where roses swayed in the fading light. The world outside moved on, seasons turned, but the truth, like the roots of those roses, remained. She smiled faintly, the peace of resolution softening her features. For the first time in a long time, she felt whole. And as the day slipped quietly into evening, her story, Her fight, her patience, her legacy was left behind, not as a tale of bitterness, but as a testament to endurance. Share your thoughts below. If it were you, would you forgive? Or would you fight for the truth? And don't forget to follow Family Stories Collection for more unforgettable tales of betrayal, justice, and hidden truths.